Hi folks, welcome to the first Alchemy Moon Creators Podcast, where we explore the ins and outs of new releases coming your way through Gemini Artifacts. For Alchemy Moon, I'm John Green, and today I'm talking with Chris Gould, and we're going to be chatting about the big new development from Alchemy Moon, an evolution of ideas you've seen in earlier releases, but which is really a new milestone in many ways. Many people have probably seen the launch page of Alchemy Moon at Gemini Artifacts, and a lot of the favorites from the earlier incarnation of the moon have made a well-received comeback, but it's this new release called the Artifactum that seems to be one of the most interesting. And after seeing it in person, I would have to say that's more than justified. Today we're doing our first transatlantic chat, separated by about 6 hours time difference. Hi, Chris.
Hi there, John. How are you?
Before we get into this new release, this is the first exclusively new product in the Alchemy Moon line since you've joined up with Vic Nadada, right?
It is indeed, which is great. You know, it's working very well for me because I think that what I realized, which is something that should have been very obvious to me, is that I have no interest in the business side of things at all. So going with Vic means that he can handle that stuff a lot better than I ever could. And it frees me up to just do the creative stuff, which is where my head is, really.
Well, Chris, we've seen the photos and many have watched the videos. Tell us, what is the premise of the Artifactum?
Yeah, it's a it's a bit of a complex question, really, because my idea is to produce something that works on many levels. So if you have the Artifactum, you can go through the book and you can do a few, very instant routines with it straight away. But the more you dig, the more you go down the rabbit hole and find out different uses that it can be put to, from straightforward performance right through to, let's just say for now, something a little bit deeper. So the basic idea is that it's a utility device rather than a trick. I mean, it's not a trick. There are tricks in the book, and there are routines in the book, and there are ideas that you can play with. But it's more of I like to call it a laboratory for ideas, where you can put together the pieces of the jigsaw in whatever way you want to create something that's unique for you.
Well, that sounds a lot like the previous release called Alchemical Artifactum, right? What's the connection?
It's an interesting story because it parallels my own development in magic and what I wanted to do and what I want to do and what I want to do in the future. With magic is told in that story of the evolution of the Artifactum. The original AA, which I worked with rather splendid Mr. Paul Prater on, was a very simple idea that we had, which was to just bring out the ESP cards in a different format. I mean, I love ESP tricks, but it was getting dull, the whole thing about, Dr. Ryan and Duke's University and blah, 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 all of that kind of stuff. And the actual routines themselves only become interesting if they're repeated over and over again. And if you repeat something over and over again, each time you repeat it, it inherently becomes boring. So there's that sort of like paradox for me in using ESP card routines. And yet there's a lot of really good ESP card routines out there. So the idea of the alchemical artifact was very simple, was to produce a set of ESP cards in disguise. And we wrote routines around this that utilized the new context. But at the heart of it, it was really, here's some ESP routines that you can do in this more magical context. And it worked for me in my own performance. It, instantly made performances of ESP card routines far more interesting for the audience because they were dealing with something other than a 1 in 5 chance of getting something right. But here's the interesting thing. My idea with the Artifactum was really just to rework the alchemical Artifactum. But it's been a long process. It's been 2 years of fairly intensive work, and I've been thinking about it since the alchemical Artifactum was produced, I guess. So the ideas evolved away in the same way as my ideas about magic changed. I was less interested in the idea of doing a trick. And I'm going to call a spade here. I suppose I should define it. A trick is something where you are fooling the audience. You're telling them that you're doing something that you're not, and they're trying to figure out how you did it. That's the basic premise of most stage magic, I think. But that's how I started to view it. And I started to become restless with my own performances, and whenever anybody said to me, "Oh, you're clever, how did you do that?" I took it as an insult, because it meant that they weren't experiencing something that was fundamentally magical. So my idea started to take a new, and I think in terms of magic, quite a radical direction, and that is towards actually performing magic. By that, I mean authentic magic. And that works on very many levels. On the very surface level, what I want to do with the Artifactum is get people to experience something that they see as authentic magic, something that doesn't look like a card trick, something that doesn't look like, this guy on stage has done something clever or set them a puzzle that they can't, get the answer to. I want it to, this is going to sound very pompous and it's not meant to, I want it to extend their paradigm a little bit. I'm going to go on a bit here because I'm getting onto my hobby horse, but I think one of the great problems, and I've said this many times, I'm going to repeat myself, but one of the great problems in society at the moment, not just magical performance, is that we don't have magic as an integral part of that society. In fact, we decry it. And what I'm going to say now is going to offend a lot of people because of that. We have a very dry scientific view on how the universe works. A dry and valid view, incidentally. I think that there is not one reality and there's not one perspective of looking at reality. But the idea I guess I want to get across is the fact that the Artifactum developed alongside my own ideas on what magic could be. And what I'm trying to bring to the table is something that I hope will be received positively as an attempt to integrate performance magic with at least the experience of authentic magic for the audience.
So with Artifactum, you have evolved the system into one that's simultaneously simpler and yet also has more dimensional depth. Can you give me some examples of how that plays out in practice?
People can use the Artifactum as they want. It's entirely up to individuals how they use it, what presentation they give it to that fits into their, world beliefs about things. But my hope is that people use it in a way where they give people this experience of authentic magic. And you'll know that you're doing that. And people have already had this experience many, many times performing even the most mundane card trick. When the person's in front of them, and their mouths are open, they can't speak. Because they're trying to process that information. How does this fit in with my paradigm? It doesn't. So what's going on? Now, unfortunately, most magicians then debunk that and take that magic away. And they say, thank you very much. Aren't I a clever sod? I know I've talked about this many, many times, but I think it's a crucial thing if we're going to evolve magic into an art form, that we hold on to that magical moment that the person is experiencing, and instead of just discarding it and waiting for some applause, that we build that up. And using it in that way is the way that I intend it to be used. Although, of course, you're totally free. I always build into anything that I do, and this is like even the simplest card trick, the idea that the performance doesn't end when the curtain goes down, that it carries on happening after the performance, which is why a lot of stuff like, I don't know, Death in the Family is a good example. You're throwing people little pieces of jigsaw of a story that they have to assemble and put their own missing pieces in, and it's that. I think really the more it brews in the mind of the person, the more the magic occurs in the mind of the person that's experiencing it, the more magical it becomes. The more it's focused on the magician, then the less magical it becomes. Does that make sense? There's a couple more points I'd like to make about the performance magic aspect. And that's one that is to do really with a very personal thing, about where my own magic is going. Because I used to perform on stage fairly badly, if I can remember. And I've kind of like lost interest in that. And I was talking to a friend of mine who, unfortunately, I don't know where he is at the moment. And if anybody does, it would be great to hear from them. But Nyama, we were talking about ideas of what magic should be, and we were talking about the ideas. I mean, instead of doing a magic show or performing in a set arena, which is fine, by the way, that's still a very valid way of doing it, but that the magicians should be magical in and of themselves, that they should be ready at any point of time. They might be sitting down having a coffee and somebody brings them the bill and they can be magical about it. Does that make sense? It's a way of being as opposed to something you put on for a specific paid show. Now, that's not me putting down traditional forms of performing magic at all, but I've been interested in exploring other routes of performing magic, and to me, it's liberating when you're not thinking about putting a show together, but when you're thinking about, just being magical when the postman comes to the door, or something like this. So, there are those things about the Artifactum that are in my mind very much when I'm doing it. And also, I think there's this sort of like false divide between performers and non-performers, and sometimes people treat people that don't perform with disrespect, I feel, because people can be involved in magic for a number of reasons, a whole lot of different reasons, and those reasons may well be performing, and performing, of course, is very much traditionally tied with the art form, but I've always bought loads of magic. I've never performed to anybody, mainly because probably some of it is unperformable. Some of it doesn't suit my style. Some of it wouldn't work in front of a live audience of a certain size, etc., etc., etc. So I've got a load of magic that I just enjoy for the intellectual engagement. Does that make sense? That it kicks off ideas. And this is why I never put down people who are collectors. There are people who buy my stuff, who buy stuff of everybody else that puts out stuff in a bizarre neck of the woods, that never will perform anything because they're going to put it on a shelf and they're going to admire it as as an object, if you like. I have no problem with that. And I'm no problem with people engaging with magic on different levels. And that idea of people engaging on different levels, from a very personal, not performing in front of everybody, to the idea of performing on a fairly large stage with people, it's there, cooked into my thinking with the Artifactum, I think. I remember when this was before I was into performance magic, and I was into, what you would call the real thing. And I used to meditate on the Tatvas. And Tatvas was 5 symbols. And really, looking back, I mean, I wasn't thinking of this when I was writing the Artifactum, but it's there in my unconscious when I'm writing it, because it's the 5 symbols of exactly the same as the Artifactum, the 5 elements. But what was interesting to me is you've got these 5 abstract symbols, of a circle, a triangle, a square, in the case of the Artifactum, and a cross, and so on and so forth. And by seeing these as a portal to the imagination, then you've got this very simple system fundamentally on the surface. You're only dealing with 5 symbols and the interaction of those 5 symbols with each other, which gives an enormous amount of complexity. But beyond that, each one of these symbols becomes a doorway into the imagination. I like to think of these as being the pillars of the Artifactum. There are these different things that you can do, but they're not individual. They can be mixed and matched. So, for example, you can do a straightforward magical performance and include a piece of individual or even group reading with that. And again, that would be, if I was doing it, to give it meaning and to give it relevance to the audience. It's not about me doing some puzzle on stage. It's about me, how can I say this without sounding pompous, illuminating the audience in some way. I don't mean that in the way it sounds, but I do mean it in the sense of what I do then having meaning for those people. Might be a better way of putting it. But so they all integrate. So you can do a little bit of visualization with that. You can introduce a little piece of actual magic. I'm not going to talk too much about this here now, but the magical performance can be a trigger for a magical event. But let's have a look at visualization then. And this comes back to what I was saying about the tatwas and the idea that you have very simple symbols that on a piece of card, they're nothing, they're just a piece of ink on a flat piece of card. But once you take those things and you put them into the imagination, and those cards then become doorways towards a visualization of a landscape behind that, then it becomes very interesting. Now, let's go back, before I go any further on that, let's go back to the nut and bolts about this, because in terms of it being a magical device that you can use, the cards are marked. So there's a very simple system. So you look at the marking on the back, which are very easy to read in even the most difficult circumstances. Not only what card is chosen, but what the two symbols on that card are. You also know something about what the picture of that card is and what the landscape behind it is, or the starting point to that journey through the landscape, and you also know the meaning of what that card means, just from keywords linked to the marking system. So with a visualization, the card becomes a doorway, which is why we will talk later about the Book of Doors. It becomes a doorway into the imagination. And this means that something very simple, like two simple geometric shapes, can give birth to something that is endlessly complex. But the idea is that the magician can accompany the person visualizing into this world and know what it is that they're seeing, which is a very, very interesting idea. I want to add a little bit onto this as well. It's not hard, There'll be a few people that buy the Artifactum and have never done this sort of work before and think it's incredibly difficult. It's not. It's really very simple, and I do hope people that have not tried visualization work, can use the Artifactum as a foolproof way of doing it, Because at the end of the day, whatever they visualize, they can go off and they can visualize what the heck they want, but then you pull them back to those two symbols and the image on the card at the end. So in traditional terms, you have a hit at the end. So it's a safety net, if you like, to allowing people to have a deep and interesting experience. One thing, while it pops into my head, that magicians particularly, and I include myself in this, often forget is that for the audience and from the audience point of view, it's the experience that is important, not the trick going right. I've had so many experiences where I just screwed up on a trick, and I could tell you tales, and I probably will, where I had a disastrous evening, where I was the worst person on stage by a very long margin in terms of getting a trick right. I mean, there was one time where every single thing I did went wrong. But I had people coming up to me afterwards and saying, "That was incredible, that was a wonderful thing." And I'm not saying this to be big-headed, by the way, because if you'd have been at the show, you would understand that I couldn't have been big-headed about it. But what they were focusing on was not what the magician was focusing on. The magician's sweating it up there. Oh my God, I hope this card turns around and it's the right one, or whatever it is. The audience don't give a shit. They really don't care. What they care about is the is the experience, the emotional experience, and the magical experience that they're getting. And by ignoring that, we don't act as magicians, we act as tricksters and puzzle makers, you know? And if we focus on that puzzle, in my view, if we focus on that puzzle aspect, we can't be magical.
That's really interesting. Let's move on to the actual physical product. What will people who receive Artifactum actually find in the box they get in the mail? And as with many Alchemy Moon releases, will there be an elite version?
Cards and a book, basically. I mean, all you need to be able to do it at this stage. I mean, that's I want to focus on that, you know, what you can actually do with the card. There's no sort of like extra bells and whistles and little bits and bobs in the box that, you know, are kind of like pretty on the shelf. It's really focused towards the idea of, well, here is the full set of the cards, and here is the book, giving you starting points for what you can do with it. On a nice little bag that Vic's put them in to keep them nice and safe. I think the first thing to say is that congratulations to Vic. I think he did a fantastic job on them, in the sense that they turned out exactly as I wanted them to do. The story is very carefully written that these cards are located at some time in the first half of the last century. So, you know, I have it in my head, anything from the 1920s, 30s to the 1960s, 70s. They're not meant to be old, but there's an interesting backstory where you can, again, it's just sort of like getting on the bus and going down a bus stop in terms of storytelling. But you then trace their lineage back through to Edward Kelly and beyond the Renaissance and beyond what we know of the history of our civilization. So there's this sort of like interesting backstory. And the idea is that these things have always existed in some form. An interesting idea for me when I was writing this is that the Artifactum is not a physical object at all. That this is a physical representation of something that exists that is somewhat similar to the Ashford record. It doesn't exist in a material realm. So these are like doorways to a non-material realm. So in a way, you know, the actual physical cards are somewhat disposable to that idea. But the cards as they've come are meant to look like the backstory contextualizes them in. That these were something that were reproduced. Well, when I perform it, I sort of have them in the 70s because I'm a kind of 70s guy. And they were sort of like, you know, back in the 70s, there's all these sort of like cheap little tarot decks going around and, you know, weird little ESP decks and different reading decks. And it kind of like fits into that. And I want it to be, the story that I tell is one of those, but it was one that kind of like got buried and, you know, nobody actually noticed it. And nobody noticed what it actually was, that this was something that was profoundly magical and came from a civilization that existed long before our civilization is my backstory for this. And then you've got these little cards in your hand, you know, and you're imbuing pieces of cardboard with real magic by how you're contextualizing them. But they kind of, to put my feet back down on the ground here, they've come out really nice. I mean, I love my little set. You know, they were so much better than the original AA because I just got those printed locally. But the thickness of them, the feel of them in your hands is, and I don't know what Vic did, but you know, the way they kind of like slide with each other is fantastic. You know, so yeah. So it's basically those cards and then a pretty substantial book, a book that I cut down from probably 1,000 pages to 200.
Awesome. Now, the cards are accompanied by a very nice cloth-bound black hardback book that's an instruction manual and an inspiration generator for ideas. But it's also more than that. Please tell us more about the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is important. I like most people, I got loads of PDFs I never look at. And there's a big difference for me between having, and it doesn't just apply to magic, of course, you know, I've got loads of books on my Kindle that I'll probably never read, but I'll read the ones that are on my shelf that I can pick up and hold, And it's that tactile thing. It's about, if you've got something that you can hold in your hands, that thing is then real, It's a real object. And I don't think that you can up that too much. Well, this is a very, very, very interesting thought. And it relates to books. I mean, how fascinating is it that you can hold something the size of, say, a paperback in your hands, and it contains all of this knowledge? That a book itself is a doorway into whatever the book is about. And it could be a novel that is creating these wonderful images in your head, or it could be a textbook that's informing you with ideas that if that's not magic, nothing is, Now, if you take that idea and you apply it to a deck of cards, and this is always something that's fascinated me about a deck of cards, a deck of cards can be a book. It can contain ideas, and the relationship of those pages to each other rewrites the book each time you use it. And this is something that, is such a big idea, and I don't think anybody, including me, has ever done it any justice, But that's the idea of the Artifactum cards. That each one of these is a book, but it's not a book in the physical realm. It's a book that you experience in a non-physical form. You experience it in your imagination. So in a way, each page of this book is an infinite library. And it's that whole idea, it's kind of like similar to having a USB stick that you've managed to put on as many books as there are in a British library, This tiny thing can contain all of this knowledge. And it's that like unpacking of that tiny thing into something huge that is, a thing that really fascinates me. And I could go on forever about this, but it's that idea of taking something very tiny and then using it as a doorway to something that is profound.
Before we end the podcast, you mentioned that you're also working on adding to the Artifactum line with some interesting accessories or new related releases, right?
If we just talk about the practical first, and I'll go on to the more complicated later. I know that a few people have asked me for this, so I'm going to try and make it happen. But just on a very basic level, I've had people already that have been playtesting and looking at the cards saying they really want a nice Moonskin case for this. I didn't want to include that with the Artifactum when it was released, purely because I wanted to keep the cost to a point that people could afford it, And if you start adding on, leather cases here and this, that, and the other, then it becomes something that only some people can afford. And to me, it's more important to get the ideas out, which is why I've always sort of looked at the idea of doing two versions of what I do: an elite for primarily the collector, and then something that is, more of a workhorse. So I wanted to put out the workhorse first. But we're then looking at the idea of producing a really nice Moonskin case. I've got one here now. That's a prototype that is pretty much there. And a friend of mine was very keen to get a Moonskin dust jacket for the book, which I kind of get, because it turns it from being a book into something that's like a magician's tomb, Tome. So we're going to be looking at that. So those are like little cosmetic things that will be available on Gemini as a purely optional thing. If people want a Moonskin case for the book and for the cards. Then we're looking at something that is going to take up probably several podcasts, because here's the story. Paul showed me a card, a board for cards that he'd made up. It was basically just a flat board with a nice bit of fluting around it and a bit of green baize on it. And I thought to myself, I want one of those. Paul made me one. So I thought, well, if I want one, I'm guessing other people will too. And I thought, well, what can we? Surely we can do something with this. It looks like a card table. It intentionally looks like a card table. You can do any card magic on the thing. But I like the idea that, again, it has this deeper facets behind it, that it's a board for performing magic with cards on, but actually there's a lot more to it, and there is. And I'm working on a routine now that takes the ideas of the Artifactum, and I probably shouldn't say this when people are, buying the Artifactum, but takes it up a notch, And I'm really excited about the ideas that I've got for this one. And I think I'm going to stop it there, But this is going to be coming out as a follow-up.
Before our chat today, you mentioned that the Artifactum is, as the video says, the product of years of development, and that it really was a collaborative project. And that seems to be a new direction for Alchemy Moon. Can you tell me more about that?
So the idea of that is and we will talk about this separately, because there's a whole, it links into the whole thing about making magic into an art form. But I would like the Artifactum to continue its development and growth in how people perform it and what they feed back into that system. Because if people just, they buy a trick, they go out and perform it, the trick's dead, It's you just then worry about, turning up to a gig and another magician's bought the same trick from Alakazam. I need to define what I mean by trick, don't I? I did earlier, trick, routine, whatever. They're just words, But when you perform something, it needs to be a live, vital thing, and it needs to be something that continues to develop and grow. So we're trying to set up, and I don't know what form it's going to take yet, but we're trying to set up something that facilitates that process. Certainly in terms of submissions, we'll be looking for submissions, and we're not giving people money for this. I'm not sort of like, giving away free gifts for it and all kinds of stuff. I don't have enough money or free gifts to give away, basically. But just for that joy of co-creation, is if that's not motivation enough for people, then they shouldn't be there anyway, as far as I'm concerned. But there should be an aspect in the afterlife of the Artifactum where people can share in that creation. And to me, that's a very beautiful and valid thing to attempt to get going, And I guess one final thing in terms of that is the only other thing that we've thought about definitely is the idea of pulling down the old Alchemy Moon forum, which was really about letting people know about our products, and making that into a library so that there's a home for anything that people contribute. We've got loads of stuff on that forum hidden away under the format of it being a forum. But if we change it from a forum into a library, where the only things in there, it's not chat between people, but it's actual content that's organized within different rooms for different things, then it becomes something of real value. Not only in terms of what you can access as information, but what you can contribute to that, and be part of that creation process.
To wrap up, I wanted to ask, if people purchasing Artifactum want to find each other and have conversations about it, how would they do that? What's going to be the community support for Artifactum, and where do people go with their questions?
That's a tough one, because nothing's actually organized yet. You see, the thing is, we may edit this out or we may not later, but towards the end of Alchemy Moon, and one of the reasons that I decided to pull it down and go with Vic is I suffered a massive burnout, because here comes the poor me moment, yeah. But I was writing this stuff. I was doing all the drawing. I was printing it. I was making the stuff. I was sending it off in the post. I was, doing my books and dealing with the tax office, all this kind of stuff. I was writing a website from scratch. I was running a forum. I was doing a Facebook page. I could go on like this for a long time. And towards the end, I was not doing anything creative because I was just dealing with, forum posts and which is really valuable to me. Having contact with people is probably and having feedback from people and just being pleasant with people is really one of the main motivations for why I do this. So I didn't want to get rid of it, but I just woke up one morning in the same way as I did when I left work and thought, I can't do this no more. It is too much. Now, we were talking about the idea that this facility can happen if it's supported by the community. Yeah. And this is where my head is at the moment with thing. But this is not a definite. And that is that if we have a library, we need curators. Yeah. So if somebody comes up and says, I will be curator for the Kadar library, I'll be curator for the Artifactum library, and that person has a pretty simple job, of just sort of like taking people's posts and then putting them up on the forum in an organized manner, then it's feasible. If I do it all, then either that's what I do with my life, or I create stuff. You can't do both because there's not enough hours in a day to do that. So it's a case of if the community wants that to happen, the community will make it happen. If it's not important to the community, then it won't happen.
Chris, thanks very much for your time, and thanks to all of our listeners to part 1 of the Artifactum podcast. And for those of you who've already purchased Artifactum, you will be able to listen to part 2 a little later on, where we dig a little deeper into the specifics of performance and the philosophy behind the Artifactum. Thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy Artifactum.